Okay, so welcome to STEAMish. My name is Saif Fiaz. I'm a second year medical student, and I'm joined by my favorite friends here and guests, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Today, we'll be talking about information dissemination across our society today, talking about COVID-19, talking about climate change, vaccines, A to Z, you name it, wherever it affects us, we go from there. I'll let Seth Jones here start it off if you'd like to introduce himself, and go from there.
Yeah, I'm Seth Jones. I am a medical student currently. I have a bachelor's in science and then a master's in medical sciences as well.
That's great. That's wonderful. And then Hanan, if you want to go next.
Hi, I'm Hanan Fazal. I'm also a second year medical student, finishing up the second year. And I did my undergrad in psychology and Japanese, and I'm from Florida originally.
And then Drew.
Hi, I'm Drew Branson. I can hear feedback a little bit, but I also have a bachelor's degree in chemistry and another bachelor's degree in science. I worked briefly as a polysonogram technician or sleep technician, and then I got accepted to medical school. Now I'm a student at the New York Institute of Technology.
There we go. That's awesome. And then best for last is Ashley.
Hi, I'm Ashley. I am a kindergarten teacher in Virginia. I have a bachelor's degree in history and a master's in elementary education.
Okay, that's wonderful. Well, really, just to start this off, we hope to be talking about just information, how people get it, how people are taught about how it's valid, how it's not valid. We have several questions we can go over. We have some polls that were filled out by different people, and even just questions that were submitted by other people that we can go over. But first, I'd want to start off with Drew, because Drew is actually his social media presence is what actually got me started on it. What is something common you're seeing right now in regards to the COVID-19 pandemic that's happening right now in terms of information, or what are some common themes you're seeing that also apply to like climate change and vaccines, or just whatever you've seen through social media?
So right now, it should come as no surprise to anyone that everybody's talking about COVID-19. And so I have taken some virology courses in the past. Of course, we get quite a bit of virology and other forms of medicine in medical school. And so I reactivated my Facebook account trying to sort of pass on my ability to interpret information and sort of pass on things that I considered to be very credible, and sort of explain things with a perspective that I thought non-scientific people could interpret. I don't think that I pass on like 100% accurate information all the time, but I at least do my best to try to vet these sources. So on social media, it's really interesting because I follow people from every end of the spectrum. Like they're friends and followers on my Instagram and my Facebook who are scientists and physicians. And then there are people who have not taken science classes probably since high school and may not have even passed high school. And so I see really a full spectrum of different things going on. It's hard to really generalize it. Some of it is really interesting stuff that I could learn from, and then some of it, they're things that I can just look at it and say that it's absolutely false. And I don't really want to repeat misinformation, but as an example, like some people are saying that the coronavirus was artificial, or that it was, cover up for some kind of conspiracy, and those will vary as conspiracy theories do.
Yeah. So when you see someone like that who is posting conspiracy theory, whether they believe in it or not, what's one way? Do you try to confront that, or do you try to tackle that in some way, or how do you approach that?
I think that, like, for me personally, and this is a very personal decision, I do try to confront it, because I think that it's important for us, and this is getting into, I think, another topic, but as medical students, I think that it's important for us to be vigilant for things like that and to try to stick up for the truth. That said, I don't work for a hospital, and if I were working for a hospital, then I would have a lot more liability than I do as a medical student. Um,
Yeah, that
so
that is quite difficult because we're medical students and we're not medical professionals, and I hope the people on this podcast know that too. We're just learning. We're second years, and we're still going through. What's a what's a cell do? So, not really. We're way more past that. But
a
anyways,
little bit.
uh, so with the rest of you guys, Ashley, Hanan, Seth, what kind of misinformation have you seen, and who have you heard it from, or maybe how have you tackled it or approached it, whether you knew it was true or not, or anything like that.
My favorite way to approach misinformation that's very blatant is to just call out the source of what it is. So if someone shares an article that has some outrageous headline and then it has like from www.pictureframes.me, like, well, that's not going to be a reliable source.
Yeah.
And so you have your own problems of um, sources that are more reliable with large organizations sharing misinformation. But if you have smaller sources that are blatant misinformation and it's very easy to analyze where is it from, that's my favorite way to tackle it. Because if you then go into large organizations like, oh, these people say this and they're written this opinion, these people say that, it's a little bit more messy and a little bit more controversial. But for smaller things, it's very easy to see through the lies.
Hmm. Okay. And how
Um,
about you? Yeah.
yeah, I was just gonna say another thing that I've noticed is the issue of accessibility. So a lot of times when someone is spreading misinformation, um, usually there isn't malicious intention, right? Like they just read something or heard something that they think is credible, and they're passing it forward. And they might have a different level of education or a different, literacy rate than someone else, like a professional who's trained. So to them, that information was accessible. Let's say they tried to seek more detailed information, but they just couldn't understand it. Um, that we have to make information like easy to access, right? Otherwise, it's just difficult, and you're reading through different websites at different levels of complexity and stuff. So I think a lot of times when you do confront someone, like come from a gentle place, because that might to them be it might be a really difficult thing for them to understand. So especially I think as medical students, that's something I've realized is the hierarchy of information, right? We started off as like babies basically and not knowing what was going on, and now we know all of these complicated acronyms that doctors use, and we feel empowered by that new knowledge. So I think when it comes to the general public, just being really gentle and remembering that everyone has a different level of education or background that makes them an expert or a beginner in different areas. Another thing that I think is a problem right now is like certain sources that you would see as credible in the past may not be right now. So
Yeah.
something I think is interesting. You asked for like a specific thing right now with the COVID-19, and it's the use of hydroxychloroquine for
Yeah.
treatment. And we can talk about that too if you want to more in depth. But there are doctors and physicians endorsing that, ordering that. It's on back order in some areas. Um, so a patient seeing a doctor doing that would then spread to other people. Oh, look, this medication for malaria is going to cure COVID-19, and then it spreads because it started from a physician or someone of that level. But if you actually look into the research, there's very minimal data supporting that. So that's another thing I think I struggle with a lot is a source that might have been credible because they went to school for 10 years or, they're in that research. Now, all of a sudden, they could be spreading misinformation, and you're just furthering that because you trusted that source. So,
And that's actually one thing I wanted to go over eventually was talking about, yeah, there's misinformation, specifically with COVID, coming from various sources that are credible and not credible. But we're also getting it from people who are within the field,
mhm.
who are doctors and physicians. No, they're not trying to spread it on purpose. It's just that what they're doing, what they're saying, you have to take with a grain of salt. Because medically, we're trained to be like, okay, wait, that's not 100% true. They're trying it out, not because they think it's going to work. They're trying it out because there's some science behind it and they want to see if it works, but they don't know it's 100% true or not. And I think that's confusing not only for the public. If it's confusing for us who are within the field, I can only imagine how it is for someone outside the field. So that makes me transition to Ashley here, being outside the field. What have you noticed on your social media, your friends, your mom, anyone else, that's in your life, even with teachers and family that come in, and see their kids or have their kids go to your class? What have you noticed so far in terms of misinformation, confusion, feelings? What has your experience been?
I feel like a lot of it's very conflicted. You hear one thing one day, and then the next thing, like with the mask, like the other day, they're like, "Oh, public doesn't need to use mask," and now today, I was watching like CDC video about how to make one and how everyone needs to be wearing one. So I think that's really difficult for me as like just a normal person, knowing what steps I should be doing to keep myself safe and keep others safe. Especially having like a parent that's an essential worker, it's like, well, I'm sort of at risk too because an essential worker comes home to me, like that's their germs out there. So it's just confusing.
Yeah. No, definitely. I think one example could be when the president, he actually was announcing that hydroxychloroquine would be used, was approved by the FDA for use. When he was announcing that, what he was really trying to say was that it's approved for trials, I believe, in New York. But when me and my dad were actually sitting on the couch, and my dad's a physician for those who are at home, we were both like, "Oh, really? It's approved? I guess that's it. That's the magic pill. Then we found it." But then, the FDA and the Surgeon General came through and were like, actually, it's been approved for trials, and we had to go back and correct that. And so, unless you're skeptical to begin with, you would have just taken that at face value, like Hanan was talking about, as other people think it's true, and that's it. And we've heard about that couple out in Nevada, I think it was, or California, who actually ended up taking hydroxychloroquine that was meant for fish, and actually ended up passing away, unfortunately, due to what they heard. Uh, so that it is a confusing time because we're on the forefront of what's happening. Everything's changing by the day, and so yeah, right now this says masks are fine or masks aren't fine, and the next day you hear otherwise. So it leaves you conflicted because not only are the doctors confused who are telling us the information, but so is the public, even more confused. So we're on the forefront of getting that information in and out. Um, how do y'all think that the public is believing in the experts that are talking? And I'm talking about medical experts. I'm talking about Dr. Mike, Dr. Oz. I'm talking about people who are scientifically literate in the background, who are showing up on TV and social media to disseminate. Do you think they're doing a good and adequate job of informing, and do people listen, or is it just we're the ones seeing it because we're in that circle? Whoever wants to go first for that.
So they'll have an audience themselves that they've developed over time.
Yeah.
And so as they promote um, certain facts and realities, then the people that trust them before will trust them on that. Um, However, the people that do not normally trust them and don't normally go for them to them for information, it really won't make that much of a difference for those people.
Yeah, that
I think
sounds.
that's a really good point. And also, there's a little bit of confirmation bias that I think that a lot of the public um, sort of falls into. Like as medical students, we learn about these biases in school and how to condition ourselves to recognize our biases. But even people like Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's the lead author of Harrison's Internal Medicine, and the lead physician on our COVID response team in this country, he's come under fire at times by certain media outlets who disagree with certain things that he says, like if he contradicts things that certain news anchors or the president said, then come under attack. And so there's a little bit of politics in all of the medicine that's being talked about on the national stage as well.
Yeah. So I did an Instagram poll, and I asked, "Do you trust scientific public figures?" And I listed a couple of ones. I made a mistake on there by naming all men, actually, which was not on purpose. And and some people called me out on it. And so, I named Neil deGrasse Tyson, Bill Nye, Sanjay Gupta, Dr. Oz. Each one is not perfect, and they all have their own niche problems. But there's also great doctors like Dr. Yasmin, who's a Stanford Medical School professor who's doing great things on CNN, and we have various other online on Instagram and on social media overall, giving great support to the cause. But so I asked, and I said, do you trust them? These are just public figures, not necessarily experts in their field, but these are people who are seen as a source on social media or on the news. Whereas Dr. Fauci, I consider more of an expert who's been hired for a specific cause, and that's his specialty. So it's a little bit different because we know for sure. Well, we don't know for sure, but I have high confidence in him because of his position. Whereas these people don't necessarily come from that background. So 53% of people said no, and 47% said yes, they do trust them. Now, it was a small number, I think, that answered it. It was like 20 or 30 people. Oh, it's like 34 people. Yeah, 34 people who actually answered the poll. So it's still relatively small, but it was no predominant in the very beginning. So why do you think people have this mixed reaction to public experts? And I might have named some that are a little less trustful than others, so it is a gradient for everyone. But what do you think are the main factors that go into each? I know it's a complicated question, but uh, into trusting each person. Ashley, you can go first.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. What makes you trust someone? That's the thing.
Well, I was just thinking, like, an interesting point, like, all the people that you named are more liberal, and knowing that at least we come from, I feel, a more predominantly, conservative area of the country.
Hmm. We're in Virginia,
I
which
was thinking
is.
that could be more of, like, an interesting point.
I mean, that is one thing, is that we do have a lot of experts or scientific public figures that do run a little more liberal or in their politics. But I don't think what they're saying in terms of what's objectively true should change across the board. And that is one thing. I did try to look up different people who range in the political spectrum who were experts, and I couldn't think of any, unless you guys have any who were valid in my opinion. Now, obviously, that's in my opinion. Now, that's a personal truth, uh, but but that is a good point you make, Ashley, in terms of political spectrum.
Yeah, I think it's hard to have this discussion without bringing politics into it, which I think Drew mentioned earlier. Um, a lot of it is, will someone even be palatable for someone from the opposite spectrum politically?
Mm,
For me, I'm gonna be honest, not really. Like,
yeah.
and a lot of the times your social media caters to what you like, and it keeps polarizing you into this corner of, like, tracking your likes, the people you interact with, the kinds of articles you like to read. So you're not really being exposed to people with different opinions politically and in other ways too. I know I'm in this like little liberal happy bubble, and it makes me really comfortable. Like, all my
Yeah.
friends agree with me, but do we really need to be comfortable in order to fully assess like what's going on, and to address the weaknesses in this? Because I know I don't engage enough with people who think differently from me, and it's because I like being comfortable, and that's where my energy comes from, right? Um,
Hmm.
Especially when it comes to confronting people on social media. Is that a healthy way to have those discussions? That's another topic. But yeah, I think if you know someone's political affiliation or their politics that may be involved in hurting different populations or things like that, I know that is something that turns me off to being open to anything they're saying on another topic. Because in my head, I'm thinking, what this person is saying right now may be factual and objectively true, but in my head, I know that they have said this in the past, and that was really offensive or harmful, or they align with political ideas that I may or may not agree with. So and I realize that may be a way of being narrow minded, but I think in a lot of ways, like, that's how people think, is your family and who you interact with, like you just surround yourself with people who think like you oftentimes. So I think it's a part of it is we should be comfortable with being uncomfortable if we want to learn and grow and engage with people different from us. So I think yeah, a lot of times when it comes to who I trust in terms of expertise, it makes me more comfortable knowing that a lot of their major morals or ethical decisions in life align with what I believe. So that's just a personal opinion, though.
Yeah, that holds true
Um,
for me too. But yeah, go ahead, Drew.
Sorry.
No, you're
Um,
fine.
I was also thinking about the like the ways in which we evaluate the truth. I mean, a lot of people, their sort of gut instinct will be to side with people that they like, but I think that there is a little bit of a disconnect in the idea of how scientists determine what is true. We have methods to do this, and we use statistical analysis to at least approximate the truth if we can't identify it. Um, and that's where a lot of these like predictions and studies come from. We don't have crystal balls; we have math, and um, and I think that it's important to communicate to the public in times like this because we do live in a country that has lower than average STEM literacy, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And
And
so even if,
art.
I'm sorry,
And
and art,
art. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
but it's uh it's very important to have sort of maybe going forward it would be important to communicate a way in which we can identify believable information, whether it comes from an expert or not. I mean, someone might not necessarily be an expert, but they could say something that's true. Um, and also realizing the hierarchy of evidence reporting. So, like, what is more valuable, the opinion of one expert or the opinion of the FDA or the World Health Organization? Um, and so that's something, once again, something that we learn as science students and as medical students, but it's not necessarily something that is general knowledge. So,
And that's the thing. I really liked what you said there earlier was we don't have crystal balls, we have math.
mm,
So which is wonderful because we have objective facts that are true regardless of what you think or believe. Uh, now the issue with that is that it turns out that from what I've read some studies earlier, I was looking it up, that facts don't necessarily change people's opinions unless they're really able to actually let go of their guards and actually look at it and interpret it for themselves. And the issue is, unless you're scientifically educated, or even if you come from just a college graduation, or even from a proper high school education, most people won't be able to interpret the data that's coming out of there. Uh, and the thing is, we're left, either people online or people who are advocating for the right, for the objective truth, are left translating that for people and what that really means. And I think sometimes that data gets lost in translation, and that's another issue to begin with. Because it's one thing to be right, and you can be right all you want. It's another thing to be actually true and like effective in changing someone's mind. Uh, that's a great point, to bring up. Uh, and one thing I wanted to bring up was going back to what Hanan was saying with social media. Is like, yeah, you get stuck in your own circle of people who actually all agree with you usually, and very rarely do you get something that's anywhere outside of that, because the job of social media is to really keep you on there and interacting. Now, so that brings us up to the question, which kind of was what we talked about earlier, was is social media responsible for the information they feed us, whether it's really, really wrong or really, really right? I mean, or it's just malicious. What do you guys think?
So I think the rise of misinformation in social media really isn't social media's fault. It's a
Hmm.
human problem
Yeah.
of people want to have easy, straightforward solutions, and they want to see everything very clearly, and so that requires very short, very decisive statement. So whenever you have an issue that's not blatantly obvious and you start having different people weighing in on it different ways, they have to make a statement that's very decisive and precise for people
Hmm.
to read it and pay attention. And so that leads people to believe a certain way, regardless of what the data says and what the sources are from.
Right.
Seems like an advertising or branding kind of issue at that point.
Hmm.
But if that's the case, then misinformation is just as powerful as new information, you know. So,
So we did another poll uh, with the same 34, 35 people who answered on Instagram to see where they get their information from. And I said, where do you get your news from? Mainstream news source, which includes CNN, Fox, NBC, CNBC, stuff like that. International news sources like Al Jazeera, BBC, which I've actually just found out BBC is the oldest broadcasting company or news source in the world. Social media, and then I also had a fill in the blank for others. So a lot of people picked the two big ones was mainstream news source and social media. Obviously, there's a lot of mixing where a lot of people did a lot of write-ins and said that they got stuff from various sources uh, and got them from all of them. Even one of them even said they got their news from me, which I don't think that was Ashley, but
wow.
He sends me articles every day.
so how important is the diversity in what you're eating, and how much do you think that how much do you think the general public is doing that to begin with?
I don't think they're doing it enough.
Mhm.
Um, it is hard to decipher like true sources,
Mhm.
but I think like in this world, like people just stick to one area, and that's all that they listen to. They don't vary and get different opinions. And as we know, like media does have a lot of bias. Um, the broadcast or like your social media, as we were talking before. So I think that definitely like affects their views.
But what really matters is where you're also getting that information. Is it just Facebook and Instagram? Is that diverse enough necessarily, or is it a little bit of CNN, a little bit of Fox, a little bit of BBC or Washington Post or the Associated Press, um, and they all lie in their own spectrum within news sources on how biased they can be. So we did actually get some questions in from some people regarding our. Let me pull it up over here. Just questions, and actually, one of my friends here asked, "Do you think there are any news publishers that remain truly unbiased? Can media truly be unbiased?" And I think that's a loaded question. And take that away. Whoever wants to go first.
I
I
think
mean,
the only way I guess you can be truly unbiased is if you're just talking numbers and you're
Hmm.
literally giving statistics and you're not interpreting them, you're not giving your opinion, or
Yeah.
if you're, looking at previous studies and just saying that this study showed this. And so literally just math, like numbers, showing numbers.
Hmm.
Anytime you try to analyze and extrapolate from that data, you're putting your own opinion in. I think even for us, like as medical students, we take this implicit bias test. And even if actively you are conscious of certain things, you will always just have a bias, whether that be walking by someone on the street, you'll have a thought. And even if it's not a conscious thought, that's part of your implicit bias, right? So I think that happens a lot in whether that be articles or news. It's not the actual facts that they're presenting that matter as much as the way they're packaging it. So you can hear the same fact from multiple news sources, but the way that they package it is different. And everyone has their own preference for, the what kind of ribbon they like on their package, or, whatever way that they like to hear their information. So whether that be the image accompanying the article, with different information from different places, um, there's certain psychology behind the image that you're going to put on the article, right? So
Hmm.
something that I'm thinking of right now is when it comes to crime, whether you include the mugshot of the criminal or you include, a picture of them happily playing sports on a sports team, and like to be blatant about it, I'm talking specifically about race related crime, right? So a lot of times you see people of color, especially African Americans, if there's a reporting of a crime, like it's their mugshot. And then if you see someone who committed a crime and they're a white athlete at a, prestigious university, it's about their career as an athlete and how, you know,
Yeah,
that's the
no,
kind of thing I'm talking about, is the way that it's packaged. Like the same fact can be presented in two different articles, and the facts are all the same, they line up, but it's the way that it's presented, and that is all feeding into your implicit bias that you have, whether that be conscious or not.
yeah, no, that's definitely true. And the thing is, a part of journalism, and I don't know if this is right or not. It's just me spitballing here, but uh, part of journalism, in my opinion, is the human touch in terms of who got the information, how they got the information, who's delivering me the information, and what and their kind of take on it sometimes, and their voice behind it. And so, yeah, you're right. News sources, basically, in the end, we're answering the question saying it's not really possible because everyone has their own point of view. And if you have a point of view, then that means you have some sort of bias. And it's impossible to, well, it's possible, we could just have all math, uh, which I don't know how successful that would be. Maybe we could try that out, but
It would just, yeah, it would just be like, there was an earthquake, death toll blank, police showed up at blank, end of
mhm,
article.
yeah, yeah. No, you're right.
Even with
And
numbers, like sometimes they can, sort of feeding off of what Hanan said about how like the photographs that you use for different people who are convicted of crimes can sort of shape the story and shape the bias. You can also select like rule in or rule out certain data, and that's something that we see a lot of time with misrepresentation of certain data that's done by news sources, and especially with science because it is. Um, such an exclusive sort of community. Sometimes even science journalists can report on things and their interpretation can be wrong. And so
mhm,
they may be reporting facts, but then through the interpretation, they end up saying something that's either incorrect or perhaps a lie. Um, and so you need to be very careful, even with the news sources that you trust, because I mean, I don't follow a single news source that I haven't identified at least some kind of false or misleading information coming
oh yeah.
from. And there are worse offenders, but I'm not going to say what I think are the worst. So,
Yeah, and
That's especially true whenever you do information gathering and then data use to find a predictive model of what's going to happen in the future. Because you can have 10 different people look at the exact same information and get 10 completely different models and predictions in the future based on what they think is important, what they believe, what data they use, and what data they throw out as outliers. So even if you have people that are reliable using reliable data, you can get a model that either is predictive of the future or is not and is completely wrong, and you won't know until the future comes.
Mhm. Yeah, along with that, I worked in research for a few years, and there is some high desperation when it comes to just wanting to publish your data and get out of the way and just move on, especially if you're a PhD student or something like that. Um, it's, I mean, I'm not going to say that it's common, but it is possible to publish a paper with false data and get it in a high impact journal. It's not impossible to do that. Uh, just getting your p-value to be, significant, you
yeah,
just have to change a few numbers that you actually got, and then you can get it published. So even when it comes to numbers and data, we can't always be 100% sure that it's factual, but yeah, there's publishing is a whole different area. Again, there's like different journals with different prestige levels
mhm,
and impact factors, and you can publish in a journal and they won't even, peer review it or look over it, and you'll just get published, and then now you're allowed to add that to your CV and say, I was published, therefore this is fact. So that's not to put more skepticism into the world, but it is
well,
not possible to edit data.
I think
I
that's
think
one thing. Oh, go ahead.
I think many times, at, depending on the impact and depending on how many eyes end up getting on that journal, oftentimes that will fail the review process, even if it does get initially published. And one really high profile example that I was thinking of as we're telling your story was the Lancet article that linked the MMR vaccine to autism.
Yeah.
That was published in one of the leading medical journals in the world, but it ended up being completely false and causing social fallout that we still see today,
Hmm.
and led eventually to the resurgence of measles in the United States. So, I'm sorry I cut you off.
Oh, no, no, that's fine. The more you cut me off, the better, because you guys have such great things to say, I think. No, I'm not saying that you cut me off. You didn't cut me off, but uh, what I was going to say was that, yeah, the interpretation of data is really up to the person who's doing it. It varies from person to person, but that's where it changes from being a hypothesis that's still being formulated and proven to a theory, which has been proven by multiple studies that kind of converge on one objective fact. Saying that we have all this data that's supporting it, which I feel like that's a real easy uh, attack that a lot of people make on like evolution. It's like it's just a theory, or even with climate change. Yeah, we sure it's just, you might think it's a theory or you might think it's a prediction, but we actually have we have a lot of data supporting this topic, and then translating the vast amount of data and how the scientific method works to the general public is that's where it kind of gets tough, because like this is how it works and this is how we did it, so it must work. But a lot of people don't buy into that, and so that's where I feel like, for me at least, when I was in high school and in middle school, I had a lot of teachers who actually were adamant on teaching me the scientific method. And I think the public education system did me good in terms of really, really trying to hone in on how to really get rid of the biases within you and look at data objectively, not only in my science classes, but also in my history and my English class, anything like that. Um, Ashley, I know you're a teacher, so, and I know your kindergartens, you're starting them off young, and you did talk a little bit about how you guys might do that with your children, starting off at a young age between what's true and what's not, and just starting off the basic framework so that they can take off with that. How's that?
So in kindergarten, we typically teach nonfiction and fiction writing or writings stories. So we would get books about animals or different fun things for the kids and show it to them, read it to them. For our division, we did it in December, which is a terrible time to do fiction and nonfiction. But we would have like Christmas around the world books, or these show that, oh, these are real pictures, they're not drawn, table of contents, finding facts in there, sharing facts about what we learned versus reading another story about polar bears are talking. And then we have to ask the kids, oh, well, do polar bears talk? Is this what we see? So just basic stuff like that is where we start out the kindergartners at. And then obviously, like, it works itself up to doing research on
Hmm.
their own, finding sites like PebbleGo, which is nonfiction writing, um, and different ways like that.
Okay. And how about for you guys, and girls? Sorry, y'all. I should really be using you all. Uh, how have you guys learned that? Have you all used that uh, in undergrad or even in high school? Do you remember a time where you were taught this, or was it kind of iffy? And I know you all come from different backgrounds, so what do y'all think? Whoever wants to go first.
I mean, I certainly learned the scientific method early. It's hard for me to remember exactly what did, but it wasn't really until I started getting engaged in scientific research myself that I sort of understood how nebulous and sort of non-segmented the scientific method really is. I mean, we teach it as a series of steps, and it does sort of have a stepwise progression, but really science has a huge human component as well that I think is lost a little bit in the early sort of understanding of science. And also, I think that one of the pitfalls of science education is like if teachers try to teach science as a body of facts rather than as things that you can discover and things that you can know, and sort of expressing how this experiment was done and how was it figured out and who were the people around it and what was believed before and how did that change. Um, And so I think that there is a huge potential in science education to bring in like many different disciplines like history and art and even like religion and language, because even the way that we express ourselves, like speaking English or speaking Japanese, um, can be different because of just the linguistic capabilities of that language. So
Yeah, all
Oh,
I really remember learning is, along with the scientific method, of course, um, just like teachers being on my ass about like APA format, MLA format.
Chicago.
Stop, yeah, who,
Oh
what?
man.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, and just like typing in on Google APA format generator, and then it would make it for me. And
Yeah.
other than that, like citing, I think I really learned when I started doing research. But before that, yeah,
Hmm.
just being yelled at for using Wikipedia as a source. I
Hmm.
fully understand that now because it's very easy to make a Wikipedia page for anything. Like
Oh yeah.
we could make one for this podcast right now, you know? So,
Not a bad idea.
but
some people can
yeah,
cite us.
I don't know how much people learn in school now. I feel
Hmm.
very different from the generation in school right now, from where they are compared to where I was in middle and high school. Um, so yeah, I don't really remember in depth being taught that, you know, where your source of information and where you get it is very important. Just like when I would present something, I would just say, oh yeah, I found it on this website or in this textbook or in this. And I didn't really become like skeptical of things until I became more politically involved and in college, when I feel like that's around the age when people start developing, you know, their moral compass and their ethics and their beliefs. They start voting. So I think it definitely not in middle and high school. I did not, that's a personal thing. I just didn't care. I was like, oh, I
Oh no,
just
it's fine. Yeah.
true. My mom told me. And I love my mom. So yeah, I think definitely when I got older and realizing now the consequences of misinformation, it's really hard to reverse. Especially how Drew brought up the autism paper from like so many years ago. Even now, if you tell people, you know, it's all been, you know, falsified, and there are so many people who are on that paper. I think majority of them retracted everything they said. And yeah, you, even if someone comes up to you and they say they don't vaccinate their child because of XYZ, and you say you falsify all of that with data, I in my experience, they still don't change their mind. So it's really hard to reverse misinformation. So I think it is important to show that to students at a young age.
Yeah. So that's the thing is with having a conversation with someone who has a strong belief, there's a certain bias that exists out there, and I think it's called backfire confirmation or backfire bias, where if you tell them they're wrong or straight up just show them the facts that they're wrong, they dig in even further into their own thoughts and fight back even harder, regardless of how, you know, how much contraindication there or how much contradictory information there is out there, which is kind of tough to combat because you're trying to really fix the issue. And what they found is working with them in a way and bringing up things that relate more to that specific person might work. And that's really tough to do. Knowing your audience is a huge thing when you're dealing with these kind of things. And each person is very different. Uh,
Yeah, I think even you experience that every day in little conversations with your friends. I've personally learned the way you use your language is really important, to make sure you're not making it a personal attack. You're not using words like you are wrong or you, et cetera, et cetera. It's really important the way you use language. And I like to, even if I'm lying, I like to be like, oh, you know, I thought that way too. Or, oh, there was a time that I saw that as well. And that kind of softens the person because they realize
yeah.
like, oh, you too. Or I'm not
Mhm.
saying to lie, but I think using language that is less, you know, attacking the person, and more gentle, and remembering the purpose of that discussion. The purpose is not to be right. The purpose does not have to be to change their mind. It can just be two people coming together, sharing opinions, sharing facts, and ultimately coming to a conclusion that, you know, is best for everyone. So
one good example I can think of right now is, again, going back to let's just change from COVID-19. Let's talk about climate change here. With climate change, the huge issue that's coming up, and one thing that a lot of people say is like, "Oh, it's not going to affect me. It's not going to bother me. Uh, why should I really worry at all?" And one of the consequences of climate change is rising sea levels. Now, if truly the government and people didn't believe in it, nothing would be done. But the military is doing huge changes to actually combat and prepare for climate change. Insurance companies who have vested money in it have definitely changed the way they work for climate change that's coming up. Uh, and so, one way to say is like, if you want, then if you don't believe in climate change, why don't you go buy a beachfront house and see how that goes and get it insured? And that might be something. I heard this example from Neil deGrasse Tyson, actually, who talked about it. He's like, that's a good example just to use, just to see what they say. And this is just one example of working in a different way rather than being like, well, here's the data, let me shove it in your face even more. Which in our opinion, in the medical school, that's how it works for most things. Is like, here's the data, this is why it's right, this is why you should use this medication. Now go use this medication. But in the real world, it's a whole different story, and how to relate it back to people. But the thing is, when we were in school, it was different than how it is now. Because when we were in school in the 2000s, I believe that's when most of us were in like middle school, high school was in the early 2000s, even elementary school. So computers were still an upcoming thing. Internet wasn't really a huge thing for us to use at the time. I really wasn't into computers till ninth grade, maybe eighth grade. Uh, and so now the technology has really trickled down to where they even have iPads for elementary school people, uh, and they're being trained on how to use it. So one thing I did is I went on Reddit here and I asked on the teacher's subreddit here about uh, what's being done now and today. And if Ashley talked a little bit about it, and she talked about what they're doing in terms of kindergarten, but just to see what teachers are doing now. And it seems like they are trained to do it, but the general consensus I'm getting is that they're low on resources and they don't have the administration with support to be able to actually execute these things, actually give these students the skill sets that they need. Um, so what do you think about that, Ashley?
So my district was fortunate enough to get a DoD grant from the Department of Defense, and we got all this different STEAM technologies. So we had Orzobots, Kibo, Kobe, all these different, I would say they're toys, but they're technology and they're coding. We also got iPads that went along with them. And a lot of the higher grades use them to do research, to do problem solving, to do coding, finding out where the bugs are, and just to explore more with the technology. So I think that's kind of interesting. I know a lot of other schools have incorporated like the Pebble Go sites, the research-based sites, to bring that more into the classroom so that they're doing more dense research that's at their level of learning. Because like a first grader or second grader is not going to be able to go to a big research paper, read it, understand it, and type a paper about it, but they can go on Pebble Go and they can read like an article about where penguins are from or something random like that, and turn that into their own research project where they're starting to do this research based. So I think more grants are coming out to facilitate this technology learning, and bringing that more to the classroom even at younger ages.
The thing with the technology is that it's really useful in schools that can afford it or even get grants or lucky enough to get grants for the attention that they need. But unfortunately, we have plenty of schools here in the Hampton Roads area in Virginia, even in Arkansas, even in Florida. I bet there's places that can't afford or can't even get someone to even look at them in a way to get the grants and the attention that they need. So, have you guys have heard anything in Arkansas or even in Florida about what's if there's anything happening in the schools? I know it's kind of tough because we're way past that now, but sometimes you hear something through the grapevine.
I do have a few friends who are educators. I haven't really talked to them about the place of technology, but I do know that things are changing, even in Arkansas. Unfortunately, I just don't have that information right now.
No, that's fine.
I know in Texas for the private schools, they've really had a lot of success with that. Of they'd have a flipped classroom of a student's homework was to take home the iPad and then watch the video lesson on what is going on, whether it's math or history or whatever. And then when they come into school that day, they'd work on physical worksheets of what is it, what's going on, do you understand the material, work with other students, and then if they have questions, the teacher's right there to answer. And so the private schools have had a lot of success with that, but they have not made the transition to public schools yet. They're adding in more technology for specifically coding. They're trying to push for that a lot, but the advanced technology integration is just not there yet.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the primary level of education, but
Yeah.
at a collegiate level, I know when I went to University of Florida and we had to fight to get funding for Korean language because they cut the program to fund the football team. You know,
Oh boy.
Gators. So we actually we had to show that there was interest first of all in the program. So we had a petition and we had to get hundreds of signatures, and actually we successfully, it was after I graduated and left that I heard that they finally got the language program back, so it's fully funded now. But again, who knows how long that will last, how many years that'll last. We also had a Hindi language program that got cut because there were only 10 students taking it. So I'm sure funding, like a part of it is having to prove that there is a need and to garner interest for that funding, that it's necessary, have preliminary data that it is going to have, you know, positive outcomes that again are critical to education. So yeah, that was just something from my experience from in terms of getting funding.
Well, yeah, that's the big thing with technology is that A, is it affordable? B, will it be effective? And do we really need it? Sometimes technology is put in places where we kind of don't need it, and it's just put in there for show. Uh, you know, there's various instances I can name off for that, but we'll save that for later. And the
I
big
think
thing
that
is,
was
yeah,
I think that was sort of a lot of people's idea when we were learning telemedicine last year, and yet telemedicine is now an essential part of many people's practice. I mean,
oh man, yeah.
yeah,
It is a huge thing. I'm a huge, one of the main reasons I went to NYIT, cat out of the bag, we all go to NYIT here, except for Ashley, but not trying to single you out, Ashley, it was just a fact I was stating. So
It's fine. I got
She's an
the shirt.
honorary student with us.
yes. One of the biggest reasons I came to the campus was the use of technology because we're NYIT technology, but also within that category, telemedicine was a huge thing. I really think that's the future of what's happening. Look at us right now. We're not in the same room here. This is definitely happening, I mean, in part because of the drive for tele-education, telemedicine, tele-socialing. You can call this tele-socialing in a way. I just made that word up. But so I think you have to have that balance of where will it work, where will it be effective, and how can we use it to its best ability. And it's expensive sometimes, and schools can't afford it, and people can't afford it. I sometimes think that we're lucky enough to be in medical school where we have a school that it's within our tuition, but we have a school that requires us to have an iPad. I know of other schools, and even my dad was talking about back when he was in school, they didn't even have anything like this, obviously, because he went to school in Pakistan in the 80s, I believe. And he's like, we read all the textbooks. And he's like, the textbooks, even he back then was like, the textbooks were kind of useless. So there's some consensus among medical students even now, but I know where I'm going with this rant here for a second.
No, but Saif, what you
Yeah.
said really interested me in another topic. I'm like really interested in languages and things, so it makes me
Yeah.
think like foreign physicians, you know, who study and come here.
Mhm.
From what my knowledge, all of their textbooks are in English. So your
Yeah.
dad's studying in Pakistan, my mom's studying in Pakistan. She had to read everything in English, and people
Mhm.
here, they access information in their secondary, tertiary languages. Like that adds a whole new layer that I will never understand and never have to deal with because I grew up speaking English first. So
Mhm.
I feel like that just adds another layer is like how much of this information are we translating? What are we using to translate? Are we using real human beings who can catch nuances and make sure that
Mhm.
it's accurate? Are we using technology that, you know, might change the information in a way that could be harmful. So that's a whole different aspect to misinformation, is in terms of accessibility too, is like the person reading it, is their primary language English. So
No, that's actually a really big thing, because English as a second language, not American, English as a second language, ESL, is a huge thing actually in this area. And actually, Ashley has actually worked with a lot of kids uh, throughout her master's program, and beyond that, I believe, if I'm not wrong, with children who have English as a second language. Uh, and how is teaching and working with them brought out new perspectives to you in teaching in general?
At like an elementary level, especially in kindergarten, they're starting out, so it's not too much of a difference
Hmm.
for element or kindergarten. But when you get into the older ages, you have to break down the information into a different way. You have to use more visuals, more cues, maybe even partnering them up with, if you're fortunate to have two students of the same language background and one being of a higher level than the other. So that are just, those are some different techniques. But I'm interested in how they would do it in a higher level setting, because professors, they're not technically teachers, they're more of a research base. From at least my experience in the history department, a lot of them do research, and so I don't know if necessarily they have the same tools and techniques that I've been taught in a teaching program. So it was just interesting with Hanan and your perspective of the people that are coming in from different countries and their research, and them not really research, but and them learning about that.
Yeah, and so even if we're just talking about education here, think about the people who are in different countries who are also having to deal with this COVID pandemic, having to deal with climate change, just any kind of information that they're trying to learn. How do they learn it if some of these countries, they don't have access to even learning English? Now, obviously, we've been very fortunate enough to be raised in an area where the predominant language in science, technology, arts and math is English, and that's where usually things are translated into and made available to us. I can only imagine how it is out there, and even in our own states here in America, we have people who, especially when working on the Delta Caravan in Arkansas, we have, for our listeners here, Delta Caravan is actually a big van that goes out. It's a mobile clinic. We got funding for it, and NYT got funding for it to go out to the communities and provide education and health screenings for people in need. And so when we go out, I have people who need help with translation of simple words to me, but otherwise they didn't have the education for that. Plenty of people only graduated middle school or barely even high school, which it's just it's a fact of life that happens sometimes, and having to translate that is a whole different ball game, I think, uh, and I can only imagine how that is.
I
But
think there's also a little bit of going back to languages.
mhm.
It sort of depends on which language you speak. Like if you're speaking a language that's very widely spoken, like Spanish or Portuguese or French, then you can have access to these publications, which often exist in translation. Or other very scientific languages like Japanese and Chinese. They have very high access to these things. But then languages that are not associated with maybe G6 or G20 nations, um, or not really associated with with having a lot of science and a lot of money in the world. Um, those languages would certainly be something more of a barrier, and they may have to learn English, which would be the case, I imagine, in India and Pakistan, or some other language which may be even harder to learn than English.
Mhm.
So that's a very interesting topic.
Yeah.
So
Well, we're here at the hour or so mark. I'm gonna ask one more question, and then we'll. Is that fine with you guys? If we ask one more question, and with that, I think we'll leave something with our audience. We had one more question coming in from Instagram here. Uh, so they ask, with so much information available, how can we check the validity of claims, or how can we check the validity of our sources? This might have kind of been repetitive from what we were talking about earlier, but for someone who's not in the medical field, who's not involved in doing the research or even learning the research, what's the best way for them to learn that?
So the first line would be evaluating the source itself. Where did you hear that from? So if you have health information coming from the CDC, that's usually pretty good. If you have health information coming from your local newspaper, it might be completely fine. It might not be. And so then the second line would be, if you have a piece of information that you're not sure about, then finding that in a different place. So that's the standard within journalism of having multiple sources that all say the same thing. Then you can have at least more confidence in that being accurate. Even still, it could still be false. But that would be the first two steps to take. That's fairly easy. It just takes a little bit of time and a little bit of effort.
Yeah, I think I do something similar by looking at first the organization, so CDC, NIH, those are good places. But then again, there are so many websites, you can't be sure. So I do this easy 3-step process. First, I check the date. That is one of the easiest ways to rule out misinformation, because I think I saw a video circulating around like 500,000 retweets and likes on Twitter, and it was of a woman coughing like crazy in a hospital, and she was young, and she was saying that she was dying and for everyone to be careful, and everyone was like, wow, this young woman, COVID, whatever. And then if you looked at the date, it was from like 6 years ago, and this woman had COPD, and she was going in for surgery. So that's, I think, an easy thing to do is look at the date. And usually that's the first thing I do. The second thing I do is I check the author's name, and usually their credentials are right there, whether it be MD, PhD, BS, MA, whatever. And usually if someone's willing to put a piece of information out there with their name and their face and their contact information, they are taking responsibility for whatever that they are saying. So usually I make sure it's a real person. And then another thing I do is I make sure it's not the Onion. And then I read it anyway to have a good laugh. I read it to have a good laugh. And then, there are people who don't know what that is. So yeah, make sure it's not the Onion. And the last thing I do is an easy scan of it and see if there's references, any numbers with brackets that you can click and look down, and see if there are other papers or things that they've cited. So I think sometimes it can be really difficult to just be skeptical of everything and try to find out if this is true before I spread it. And it's totally okay to just do that simple thing and then send it to a friend and say, hey, did you see this? What do you think? And really encourage discussion with other people around you. But don't feel scared and like you're responsible for misinformation from now on if you don't thoroughly look up everything. Yeah, I think just do the simple things like looking at the date, the name, and references.
For sure.
I personally love the Onion.
Me too.
But yeah, I love it. Yeah, it gives me life. So in my preparation to be a guest on this podcast, I looked up, what is a good sort of objective metric that's out there to verify your sources. And I found this from Vanderbilt University. And I can't say that I've used it before. I have my own sort of way of trying to figure out what is a valid resource and what isn't. But I like this method because it is associated with an acronym, and it is easy to remember because it is associated with an acronym. Vanderbilt calls this the CRAP test. And the acronym stands for currency, reliability, authority, and purpose or point of view. So currency, you want to make sure that if somebody's, like Hanan said, if somebody is putting a video with somebody coughing, coughing doesn't mean COVID. It could be a cold, it could be allergies, it could be COPD. There are plenty of other things that can cause cough. It's a very nondescript symptom. Reliability, is this being published by a local news source, or is it being published by an organization that has many scientists throughout the country or throughout the world looking at this and able to call it out if it is incorrect. I mean, we talk a lot about getting your sources from the CDC and the World Health Organization rather than individuals. And one of the great reasons for that is that it is the result of many minds working together. And then authority sort of plays into that. Is this an organization of people that are actually able to talk about the subject at hand? Like if the CDC wanted to tell me something about, I don't know, the history of the United States, it's not really the first source that I would think of to look at that. But for health information, certainly the CDC has been a trusted source for almost 100 years. And then purpose point of view is someone trying to like convince you of something or sell like some kind of angle. Are they trying to promote a certain politician, or are they trying to encourage you to believe a certain way, or are they trying to simply present an objective fact? So
I like
I
that.
really like that. So crack test. Hopefully that has good branding and whatnot.
Because we don't already have millions of other acronyms we have to remember.
Oh boy,
Right.
don't even get me
Well,
started.
Mud piles.
Sickfaces.com. And oh man. But yeah, that's Ashley, did you have anything to add to that? No? Okay. Well, I'm really happy that went well. I'm sorry we went a little over here, but I think we had good conversation. And that's a wrap. That's our first episode in the books. I hope to be able to bring many, many more episodes to you all. Thank you for listening, and thank you more importantly to our guests who were able to join us today and take time out of their busy schedule to be able to bring information and talk about really interesting topics and bring it back to you all. So we hope you follow us and continue to listen to us. We are looking for suggestions, and even if you want to be a guest, do not be scared about contacting us. We're here for you all. We hope to see you in the future, and we hope to keep on learning with each other. Thanks.